Okay, hello all. Thanks everybody for filtering back in, and there's still quite a few people online. What I should quickly note for anybody who's here on in person is the QR code over here. If you haven't scanned that with your phone yet, please would you do that at some stage after this session potentially. Thanks. So we're starting a little bit late. Apologies. Daniel. Look, our first speaker in this session is Daniel Frank, who's going to talk about tailings disclosures. I guess a lot of you would know of his, I guess over the last couple of years, particularly intense involvement with the global tailings initiative or review, etc. So we'll certainly look forward to hearing what you have to say, Daniel. So I'll pass it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Hello, everyone, and it's great to be here presenting as part of the Complex Ore Bodies Day. What I'm going to present today is a collaboration between two programs at SMI. So Neville Flint, our director, set up the programs at the Sustainable Minerals Institute to really foster interdisciplinarity and collaboration between the capabilities and the people that exist in the Sustainable Minerals Institute, and also to link into the rest of the University of Queensland and as well collaborators around the world. What we're presenting here is a collaboration between two programs. So it's a bit unique, but is showing the kind of collaboration, multidisciplinary that is being fostered through the programs that have been set up. And so today I'm presenting on behalf of Martin Stringer and Rick Valenta from the BRC, but also we have collaborators from an institution called Grid Arundel, which is a centre set up between the United Nations Environment Programme and universities around the world. So Grid Arundel is represented by Professor Elaine Baker and Christina Thygesen. We also have a collaborator from Wits University in South Africa, Luis Torres Cruz, and this work is also part of the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, represented by Adam Matthews and Stephen Barry from the Church of England and John Houchen from the Swedish Council on Ethics. So what I want to present today is work that we conducted looking at the disclosures around tailings storage facilities that were initiated by the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, and what that means for the safety of tailings facilities going forward. And there's a whole treasure trove of information and data that comes from this analysis, but I'm going to just present what I can in 20 minutes, so kind of a bit of a snapshot. So the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative was formed by 112 investors representing $14 trillion in assets under management, essentially ethical investors. And that initiative was formed following the tailings facility failure in Brumadinho, Minas Gerais in Brazil in January of 2019. The initiative had really been following tailings facility failures for some time, due to the Mariana failure also in Brazil and others. And really they came together to see what investors could do to advance reform. Now, one of the activities that they conducted was a request that was sent to CEOs of mining oil and gas companies, publicly listed mining oil and gas companies, in April of 2019. The Investor Mining Tailings Safety Initiative also did a whole host of other activities, including being co-conveners through the Principles of Responsible Investment of the Global Tailings Review, which eventually developed a global industry standard on tailings management. So this activity I'm reporting on today is really the questions that went to CEOs. There was 727 companies that were contacted in this request for disclosure. CEOs were asked to respond to the questions and to then present the information on their website by a certain date. 152 companies confirmed that they did have tailings facilities, and the data that we are reporting on represents 45 of the 50 largest mining companies responded, 83% of the industry by market capitalization, and 60% of the industry actually publicly disclosed. and all of the publicly listed members of the ICMM disclose. So it's the largest survey of tailings storage facilities ever undertaken, and it has some kind of pretty interesting data, as I'll show you it in a moment. Some of the questions that were asked were kind of basics, about tailings facilities, where they are, who owns them, are they active, are they closed, are they in care and maintenance, when were they opened. Then there were some pretty interesting questions that I'll jump to around stability. So has the facility at any point in its history failed to be confirmed or certified as stable, or experienced notable stability concerns as identified by an independent engineer? And I'm going to report on some of that data this morning. There was also some questions around what's your planned storage of tailings? So how much tailings do you think you will have in your tailings facilities in 5 years' time? And we've been able to use that data to also infer global tailings storage annually. And so I'll present that data as well. We, I guess as an aside, we have published this, the findings that I'm presenting today in the Towards Zero Harm compendium of the Global Tailings Review. I'll post a link in the chat function in a moment if people want to link to that. And we also have a paper that's under review in a journal, which with a much more widely, lots more data reported. Okay, so the company disclosures reveal data on 1,743 unique tailings facilities containing around 45 billion meters cubed of waste material. In the data set, we have tailings facilities that represent 30% of mineral commodity production. And we were able to generate that estimate because what we did was we linked each facility that was in the data set with its entry in the S&P database. So we're able to link the tailings information with production information. And then we're able to scale up that data to the global production of commodity from the United States Geological Survey. So we're able to work out that our data set represents 30% of mineral commodity production. When we do that scaling up, we can also infer that there are 3,250 active tailings facilities in the world and 8,500 active, inactive and closed facilities. We don't have the ability to infer abandoned facilities, which is probably quite a large number. We're also able to infer, we're able to estimate that 11.1 billion meters cube of tailings is produced for storage each year, which is quite a bit larger than the estimates that others have made. This graph shows world tailings storage increase per year across a series of commodities. The dark grey colour is what's reported in the data set, and the light grey colour is what's extrapolated to world production using that method I just mentioned earlier. And the percentage figure is the percent of production covered by our data set. So you can see that there's quite a few major commodities that we have some very good coverage, and then there's some others that we have a lesser amount of coverage, for example, phosphate. Part of the reason for this is that with publicly listed companies being the target of the disclosures, there are a large number of privately owned companies that aren't captured by the disclosures, and also state-owned companies, particularly in places like China, India, Chile, etc. So we capture a pretty large part of the world's tailings storage facilities, a very, compared to anything else we've had in the past, a very large proportion, but still not all facilities, of course. Okay, and in terms of facility raise type, so each tailings facility is constructed in a unique way, according to the engineering of the facility. The general categories are upstream, downstream, centerline, and hybrid. They're conventional tailings storage facilities, and single raise, which is where the facility is actually not raised over time. Then there's also in-pit landform, which is where tailings is put into a pit or into a natural landform, so it doesn't have a dam that is holding it in place, or dry stack facilities, and that is where water is removed from the tailings so that it has some stability on its own right, and doesn't require the same extent of tailings dam structure to hold it in place. So what we see over time is that the number of facilities per decade, we've seen quite a change in the type of facilities that are being built. Upstream is by far the most common facility type for tailings that are out there in the landscape. But over time, the amount of upstream facilities is now in decline. So we saw that from 2000, or from 1990, 2000, we've seen a decline in the number of new upstream facilities being built. We've also seen an increase in the amount of downstream facilities being built. Now, upstream and downstream raise type just means that the direction in which the crest of the tailings raise is relative to the last crest. So if it's upstream, the crest is moving upstream. If it's downstream, the crest is moving downstream. So they're just different engineering structures. Upstream facilities have been far more controversial than many other types of facility types because they've been associated with a higher number of tailings facility failures. So that is part of the reason why upstream facilities are now not as common in terms of new tailings facilities being built. We've seen also an increase in-pit tailings storage. So that's where the tailings waste is put into the pit of a disused pit of a mine. And there you could imagine that stability is much greater because there's nowhere really for tailings to go. We are seeing, though, from here you can see that the other facility types are pretty stable, not really in increase or in decline. What I wanted to report on today, which is probably the most significant aspects of our findings, is the stability issue. And we did some analysis of that question around disclosing situations of a past stability or present stability issue against different facility types, different age of facilities, volume of facilities, etc. Here, this map shows the locations of active facilities in the data set. So that's facilities that are still receiving tailings, and active facilities that have reported a past stability issue. And the yellow is the countries with active facilities. What really this shows is that the idea that facilities that are demonstrating past stability issues are only located in areas that are wet or that are seismically active is not really supported by the data. So we see that there are active facilities reporting stability issues in very flat locations. Sorry, you still hear me? Great. So in very flat locations and also in places that are very arid and don't receive a lot of rainfall. Here you see stability by age. So what we have is the percent of facilities with a past stability issue and the number of facilities with a past stability issue shown over age. So the top graph shows the number of active facilities with a past stability issue, and you can see that there's quite an age range of those facilities. But when you look at the percent of active facilities with a past stability issue, you see that grey line here is all. You see a common trend that it increases over time, and we should expect that over time there's more opportunity for facilities to experience the stability issues, so those facilities tend to. We also have split out just a couple of the facility types here, and we see that upstream facilities in particular have very high rates of stability issues when they get quite old. Here we're talking like 80% for facilities that are quite old, 60 years and 80 years. And what we see is that we see the same trend for downstream, but in general, they have a lower incidence of past stability issue over time. The dry stack facilities are an alternative type of facility that is dewatered, so is more competent, has less potential for facility failure, and also less potential for seepage of metals and other elements in groundwater. And what we see is that there's just a single facility, active facility, that showed a past stability issue, and that facility is aged between 40 and 50 years. So we see this higher rate of percent of facility with past stability issue between 40 and 50 years. But that's an artifact essentially, because that's the only facility of dry stack that showed a past stability issue that is active. If you look by volume, we also see that bigger facilities tend to show greater propensity for reporting a stability issue. Here we have current volume by number of facilities, and we see that over time, the percentage of facilities with a stability issue is increasing as volume is also increasing. So that's to be expected as well. Larger facilities, more material, greater stresses and pressures, higher likelihood that they'll show a past stability issue. And also seismic hazard. We looked at seismic hazard versus stability, and we see that the kind of an interesting relationship. We expected that as seismic hazard increased, we would see greater percentage of facilities experiencing stability issues. We in fact found the more complicated relationship, where as seismic hazard increased from low to moderate seismic hazard, we see a decline in the number of facilities experiencing past stability issues. And as then it moved to high and very high seismic hazard, we see an increase in the facilities showing past stability issue. We interpret this in maybe two ways. It could be because that facilities are being over-engineered as seismic hazard increases from low to moderate, so that it means that they're able to withstand seismic hazard. But as seismic hazard then gets beyond a certain range, the facility is not able to cope with those stresses. The other option could be to do with where the facilities that are experiencing stability issues, upstream, for example, or as we'll get to in a moment, hybrid facilities, maybe they're not being built in locations where seismic hazard is increasing in the moderate kind of range. So it could be due to the distribution of those facilities. This is kind of the main finding of our study, and that is we were able to show that for different facility types, the propensity for them to experience a stability issue is also different. And what we found is that upstream facilities have a much higher propensity to experience a stability issue than other types of facilities. Here, this graph shows in dark gray active facilities, in light gray all facilities. You'll see that overall about 10% of facilities experience have reported experiencing a stability issue, which is a pretty high number, actually a very high number. We see that for centerline, hybrid and upstream facilities, they're reporting stability issues at a greater rate than the average. For downstream, single raise, dry stack and in-pit, they're reporting it below the average. And so we see what kind of is expected, that we kind of expected that upstream facilities were greater potential for experiencing stability issues. And we expected that dewatered facilities and in-pit landform facilities would be low. But this data is the first time empirically that's been demonstrated. And it really puts to bed this question about the greater potential of upstream facilities to experience stability issues. The error bars there are the standard error due to the sample size. The hybrid facilities, what we mean by hybrid is really there's quite a large number of facilities that start with one raise type, say centerline or upstream, and then the next raise is a different raise type. So those facilities are a combination of different raise types, and we refer to those as hybrid. We see that there's some relationship between the presence of a stability issue, the reporting of a stability issue, and governance. So we found that for OECD countries, they tend to show a slightly lower incidence of stability issues compared to non-OECD countries. And the same is true for ICMM member companies. They show a slightly lower incidence of past stability issues across most of the different raise types. They still, however, show quite a high rate. So for example, upstream facilities are still being reported at nearly 17% for past stability issues for active facilities, whereas non-OECD, non-ICMM member companies are reporting higher, like 20%, right? So it's still high at 17%, but is lower than non-ICMM. So there's some influence of governance on this data. We also were able to look at consequence. So that what's the consequence of a facility failure? Now, consequence isn't likelihood. It's got to do with what would happen if this facility failed. The top graph here shows the number of active facilities by their facility type, and the color refers to the categorization by one of the consequence classification schemes. And there's a whole host of different schemes. We tried to integrate them here into one graph. What we see is that downstream, upstream hybrid facilities, they tend to have a higher proportion of facilities that are categorized as high consequence if they did fail. And that's understandable because those facilities have wet tailings that has a higher flow rate if it did fail. Whereas, say, for example, dry stack facilities or dry stack facilities have a less propensity to flow, so we can expect that their consequence if they did fail would also be lower. And the bottom left graph here, we're showing what's the frequency of the number of facilities versus the consequence if they failed. And we see that there's an increase as we go higher consequence rating, which means that more facilities across most of the schemes are in the higher consequence ratings than the lower. So there's quite an, except for Ancold, which is really Australia, so we'd expect that it's quite flat here and dry. Most of the other schemes are showing that there's a big proportion of their facilities that are higher consequence. And the graph on the bottom right shows that, well, what about stability issue? And what does that say? And we see that, in fact, concerningly, the higher consequence rated facilities, if they fail to be greater impact, tend to show a higher percent of past stability issue or experiencing a stability issue, which is quite a concern that we would see that. And it also means that the higher risk facilities, for example, upstream facilities, don't seem to be being built at a less rate in areas where the consequence could be higher. We could expect that we've known for 20 or so years that upstream facilities show greater stability risks, that those wouldn't be built in areas that are close to communities or that have high topographic gradient that would allow the consequence to be greater, but we don't see that in our data. And our final slide, there's really been a push over the past few decades to try and have alternate methods for tailings storage that would reduce the propensity for tailings failure. One big component of that are dry stack facilities where that tailings is dewatered and then stacked. What we found is that, unfortunately, if you look over time, the number of facilities being constructed that are dry stack has not been increasing significantly. It's been rather flat. And in fact, as a percentage of the facilities constructed per decade, it's been flat for a relatively long time at between 4 and 6%. So we see that there's a need for moving to new technologies, but we're not seeing that greater uptake. In fact, when we crunch our data, we see that one company accounts for 72% of all dry stack facilities in the data set, which means that it's only a handful of companies that are really driving this transition agenda. All right, I'm going to leave it there. If you do have any questions, happy to answer them. Anything that's really difficult question, I'm going to hand it to Martin. So Martin, please get a microphone ready in the audience because all the difficult questions are coming your way. Thanks a lot for the time this morning.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Daniel. It's an absolutely fascinating data set, and I've had a look at the paper, and I would advise anybody who has an interest in this to go and have a good look at that paper because it's really it's well worth